Peacemaker Season 2 is an absolute blast, and past all the performative patriotism, depressing orgies, cultural appropriation, literal Nazis, and surprising amount of Pokemon references, Peacemaker Season 2 is actually a very apt metaphor for the online radicalization of INCELS, which is by far one of the leading contributors to the massive influx in political violence that we've seen in the US, which has everything to do with dudes like Chris Smith. Now, Gunn made sure not to be too heavy-handed with these themes, which is smart in today's political climate, but it's also led a lot of people to miss the point entirely. Luckily, that's exactly what I'm here for, so let's dive helmet first into Season 2 of Peacemaker and see if we can understand what James Gunn is trying to say about lonely men, and why he's actually right about this. Wait, what was that?
Stop! Whoa, who are you?
Are you?
From another dimension? Yes.
Oh, no way. Who's my favorite Poker?
Reboot, listen, I don't have much time, I'm from another dimension, and I'm here to tell you, James Gunn missed on this one.
What? No, that's impossible. It's James Gunn. He can do no wrong. He can do no wrong. Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell for alerts. Hello comrades, my name is The Dodd, and before I was so rudely interrupted, I was talking about Peacemaker Season 2. If you haven't checked it out, you definitely should. Not just because it's awesome, but also because everything past this point is going to be pretty spoiler heavy, so consider yourself warned. The main message of Peacemaker is that bad people can change and can do good. More specifically, that people like Peacemaker can change, which is an important distinction. Peacemaker does have a very specific identity. Gunn specifically added him in Suicide Squad because he wanted him to be this douchey Captain America type, which is something that we've seen played off in both Watchmen and The Boys. But even then, Peacemaker is put in a much more humanizing light than per se Soldier Boy or maybe the Comedian. And one of the main ways he does this is showing how lonely Peacemaker is. And I'm not the only one that's noticed this. Check out this clip from our Crazy Stupid podcast.
If you strip away like all of the comedy and the humor and like the crude nature that Peacemaker has, dude, he is a very lonely person. In the after show, James Gunn said he wanted to make Peacemaker a lot more vulnerable because the stage in his life that he's in right now, like he can sometimes feel very vulnerable. And him tapping into that, I feel like, is very timely.
This is something that many men can relate to right now due to the male loneliness epidemic. Now, what is the male loneliness epidemic, you may ask? Well, let's talk about it. So essentially, the male loneliness epidemic is a term that's been used to describe the recent uptick in men feeling more and more isolated and like they don't have a community. Since 2023, experts have described loneliness and social isolation in the United States as an epidemic. People are spending less time with friends and more time alone. Many journalists have focused on men in particular, citing findings that young men in America are among the loneliest and that they are 5 times as many men who say they do not have close friends as there were in 1990. Essentially, these studies have confirmed that men are somewhat more likely to experience social isolation than women. While social isolation is on the rise for both genders, men are more than likely to feel like they are not meaningfully a part of any community or group. Now, some say this epidemic isn't real and that this is just simply male entitlement, and they have a point. I mean, people aren't necessarily owed a community. There's a reason that becoming a social pariah is a form of punishment. Community in itself is a privilege. And as we said before, loneliness is on the rise for women too. We are all becoming more isolated. The difference is that women tend to be a lot more emotionally mature and process these emotions, either within their own communities, groups, or I don't know, therapy, while men are much more likely to repress these emotions and not talk about it even with their close friends. And this is something that we saw in Peacemaker Season 1 when Vigilante first runs into Peacemaker.
Everybody wait, good job.
That's some repression.
Peacemaker. What a joke.
Buddy?
What the fuck? Hey, what the you doing, you f***ing stalker? Dude?
And then, like, right here, immediately, what does he do? Throws his hand up towards his face. You can't see this. You can't see this emotion. Don't look at it. This is the kind of repression that leads to emotional instability, and emotional instability leads to online rage and toxic masculinity. And that's something that James Gunn is all too familiar with. He's faced a fair amount of online toxicity before, so much so that it got a mention in The Bear.
Any of you incels, QAnon, 4chan, Snyder Cut motherfuckers want to get out of line now?
And it's appropriate that he would lump incels and 4chan and Snyder Cut all in the same bunch here, because they really are one and the same. In fact, incels are the original entitled lonely men. Their name, of course, is short for involuntary celibate, which is a title that they literally give themselves. They consider themselves unable to attract women and feel the need to take their misery out on others in the most misogynistic ways possible. They've been behind some of the biggest harassment campaigns, including Gamergate, and they can be pretty feral, which is a problem because Peacemaker is an incel. Now, I know what you're thinking. Of course, Chris Smith is played by John Cena, who is incredibly Well, I get it, right? He definitely smashes, and he's even attending an orgy in the show. But he's not an incel because he doesn't smash. He's an incel because he's the perfect representation of what incels see themselves as.
Every day I wake up alone. Because females don't like nice guys.
He's essentially a manifestation of their own entitled projection. He embodies the kind of persona that incels see themselves as, the misunderstood badass. But in reality, and in the show, as we see very clearly, he's not a badass, he's just an ass. Peacemaker isn't a good person. He's a lovable person, but that's different than being good. He's selfish, narcissistic, self-destructive, but above all of that, he is deeply insecure. That's why he's constantly roasting people. He gets easily manipulated at his own expense, constantly seeking validation from his racist father so that he can get over the guilt of killing his brother. It's a complicated situation that obviously is going to weigh a lot on an individual. Unlike most heroes who are driven to heroicism to do better, Chris is just doing it to matter. He became Peacemaker to appease his father, completely overlooking the fact that his dad's a literal Yahtzee. And both season 1 and season 2 see him dealing with the direct consequences of the person that his father pushed him to be. After his father's death in season 1, he's even more purposeless than ever. And you'd think that that wouldn't be the case. I mean, he went through a whole season of making friends and building a community, 11th Street kids, right? But nevertheless, even with all those new friends, he's still killing the vibes at the orgy. And that's because all the 11th Street kids are incel metaphors too. I mean, Economos is pretty much exactly what you think of when you think of an incel. And Adebayo, severely out of touch when it comes to relationships, as you saw in the very beginning of the season with her awkward visit with her ex. And of course, Gunn makes it blatantly obvious where hardcore similarities between her and incels lie.
I've come to the conclusion you suffer from a particularly severe form of toxic masculinity.
I have a vagina.
You do your best to maintain a hard appearance.
So my face? I'm getting some sort of a bullshit non-existent diagnosis based on my face? I'll give you a diagnosis based on your face. You're a cunt.
But of all the 11th Street kids, if anyone's the biggest textbook incel, it's gotta be Vigilante, right? Not only does the guy have absolutely no riz, but he even goes as far as to lie to his mom about it. And given how hard of a time he has reading social cues, making friends who don't find him annoying, and a slight Pokemon obsession, it's not a stretch to assume that he's somewhere on the spectrum, as many incels tend to be. Regardless of any of that, Vigilante is still a sociopath. He still murders people. He still is a very violent and bad person. And you think that someone as smart as him would realize that he's no Patrick Bateman, but he sees what he does as an obligation, as his purpose, because that's what they're constantly looking for. They're constantly looking for their place in society, which is exactly what Chris discovers when he discovers the parallel universe. When he first arrives, everything seems great. His dad and his brother are alive, Harcourt is super into him. It feels like the universe where everything is as it should be in Chris's eyes, which makes the eventual revelation that this universe is Earth X, you know, the one ruled by Yahtzees, even worse. And yeah, it is kind of wild that Chris was completely oblivious to this, especially with the very obvious signs that he was in the Nazi-verse. While we hear his friends chalk it up to him just being a meathead, that feels like a bit of an oversimplification. However, it does make sense when you start to think about the way that white supremacists exploit loneliness. This is something that Crazy Stupid Podcast also mentioned as well. Let's take a look.
These fringe groups, like the Klan, exploit male loneliness to bring them into their fold, to give them a sense of community, and while radicalizing them at the same time. You can tell that Gunn has, he's lived it, and he knows when you don't have the right community, how vulnerable you are to landing in the worst parts of humanity.
These communities prey on socially isolated men, and in the modern age, they do so through online communities like 4chan or the manosphere, which is a fancy term for the rapidly growing network of mostly long-form podcast content that's specifically targeted towards young conservative men. And it includes everything from Joe Rogan to Theo Vaughn to full-blown Republican talking heads like Louder with Crowder. Now, most of us have been painfully aware of the online radicalization that's been happening in the manosphere. While a lot of the manosphere claims to be all about free speech, in reality, they just push whatever misinformation they want and whatever misogynistic agenda they think their viewers will latch onto. It's kind of like ChatGPT for the patriarchy. But the one thing all of these creators have in common is that they are haters through and through. Whether it be queer people, immigrants, women, they think punching down is edgy, and edgy gets them views, so bada bing, bada boom, they do the thing. This allows them to be unified through their hate, or at minimum, they create an environment where that kind of hate is permitted. These become places where these self-victimizing incels incels are meant to feel safe, like they can be themselves, even if being themselves includes being friends with a literal Yahtzee. Now, this is especially true for like poor, straight, white men who feel like they're the ones that are being targeted by diversity initiatives like DEI, and it's not because they are being targeted, but since many racial inequalities are really just class issues, many of them have similar struggles, and so it's easier for them to slip into jealousy when they see others that shared a lot of their same struggles. Now, none of that justifies being racist or shitty, but I am trying to explain where they're coming from and why they feel the way that they do. So when these kind of communities welcome those kind of points of view, they become a sanctuary for some of the worst takes imaginable, which feels a lot like Chris's perfect dimension. The citizens of Earth X may not seem evil at first, but it becomes real clear how evil they are the first time they lay eyes on Adebayo. Just like the radicalization of incels in the manosphere, Chris's journey on Earth X shows that when you don't feel like you have a place, you end up taking refuge in the worst parts of humanity, most of the time without even realizing it, just like our friends at the podcast said. But at the end of the day, this sanctuary is just a refuge to them. It's not necessarily their church. Just because they live in a Yahtzee universe doesn't make them a Yahtzee, right? And to a degree, that's true. But just because your community doesn't define you, doesn't mean that your community doesn't influence you. And I think that that distinction is very important, especially with the rise of political violence that we've seen happening in the US lately. The best example that I can give of this is actually the ICE shooter that we saw in Dallas. Now, when reports of the shooter first came out, we were told that this was a politically motivated attack because of anti-ICE messaging written on the bullets. So it seemed pretty clear that these were politically motivated. But when one reporter talked to the shooter's friends, it started to paint a little bit of a different picture.
I tracked down 3 friends of the deceased shooter who had known him since childhood and asked them straightforwardly, what were his politics, what were his views? And their answer was basically that he had libertarian leanings, but he was generally apolitical. And that was something that was corroborated by his own brother, who gave an interview saying, this guy wasn't political. I'd never heard him say anything about ICE prior to this. And one of the most surprising aspects of this investigation for me was talking to his former friends, and I kept running into the same issue, which was that, oh, you know, I'd fallen out of touch with him and didn't have recent insight into what his views were. I kept hearing this, and by the third time I hear it, the person says, oh, you know what happened? Probably no one knew him recently other than maybe his immediate family, because he started spending huge amounts of time on the anonymous chat forum called 4chan, and just playing video games. So apparently he dropped out of school, kind of became a recluse, lost all social contact.
Sound familiar?
Immersed himself in this world of, just to describe 4chan, provocation and trolling, and you know, people would describe it as sort of controversial site. And then there ends up being the shooting, and I ask his friends about it. Okay, he has written on, you know, these unused bullets, anti-ICE. Clearly it's anti-ICE, right? And his friends say, I wouldn't interpret it that way. He was never a sincere guy. Everything he said was laced with irony and sarcasm. He was a very sardonic person. So they were all skeptical of the idea that this was anything but some practical joke. They said that, you know, because of his libertarian leanings, he didn't like the government, and that apparently, according to investigators, was one of the conclusions they came to based on what they've been able to go over that he left behind. But that wasn't specific to the right or the left. That was a general disdain for government, and a disdain that he seemed to have for all sorts of things in life.
So while authorities have claimed that this was much more politically motivated, it seems that his friends are telling a different story. Like he did this just for the lulz, and maybe even for a little validation from his own community, or what little community he had. And we see the same thing with Charlie Kirk's alleged assassin, Tyler Robinson. While some of the bullets had messages written on them that seemed to be clearly politically motivated, we later found out that most of them were either Helldivers references or just memes, jokes. It's not necessarily the politics that is radicalizing these people. It is these isolating online communities that are driving male entitlement to a violent place. The reality of the situation is that incels or isolated men often reach this point because they are seeking some kind of purpose or significance, just like Chris. And again, not that it justifies this show obviously condemns all form of political violence, but Chris does share that with them. However, the big difference is that Chris actually finally does have a realization and realizes that he is in Earth X, right? He sees that he is in the Naziverse, and once he does, he immediately rejects it. It's a deal breaker for him. His friends are right about him. He isn't a Yahtzee just because he was comfortable in the Yahtzee-verse. And turns out what he really needed were some good friends around him to shake him out of it. He needed his friends to show him, hey, dude, you're hanging out with literal Yahtzees, you need to get out of here. Which seems like the solution that Gunn is trying to suggest here. That we need to be socially accountable for our friends and making sure that they're taking refuge in the right groups and shake them up if we need to. And in doing so, Gunn shows that even people like Chris are capable of change, which is a big deal because we don't feel like that's possible these days. Gunn first teased the idea of how even the worst people are capable of change when we find out that Chris's dad in Earth X isn't actually a Yahtzee, despite living in the Yahtzee verse, but is actually some kind of freedom fighter. And we see Chris finally take this lesson to heart when he decides to spare his brother in episode 7. By choosing not to kill his brother, he shows growth and change. That was the kind of a big mistake that he made in the other universe, and he didn't want to make that mistake again. He's not the mindless, careless killer that he once was. He learns how much he regrets being that person, and he makes the choice to enact actionable change, which is what it seems that Gunn is trying to say. We need friends around us to hold us accountable and to hold them accountable as well. And it may be the only way that we can prevent others, especially men, from falling down the lonely incel men alt-right pipeline. And even though some may seem like a hopeless case, it shows that everyone is capable of change and that everyone is capable of changing. And personally, I think James Gunn's right here.
You are still not getting it, bro.
Jesus, you're still here?
Never left, bud.
I guess I was just hyper-focused, but what exactly am I wrong about?
Not everything, but you are missing the most important thing, and not talking about it had some pretty drastic consequences on my universe, so hear me out. Let me take the wheel for a second, okay?
All right, but I'm gonna cut it if it sucks. Contrary to what my doppelganger was saying, choosing not to kill his brother was not actually a change. Peacemaker always regretted killing his brother. If he had a second chance on Earth, he would totally save him. In the end, sparing his brother is just him trying to make Earth X still the one universe that he got right. And that's part of the problem, because his brother is still a Yahtzee. Why are we humanizing Yahtzees? It's one thing if someone gets called one hyperbolically because, you know, they're making grammatical mistakes, but these dudes are literally keep a copy of Mein Kampf by their bedside table. We're talking full-blown goose steppers here. And yeah, maybe his dad wasn't a Yahtzee on Earth X, but it was a weird decision to add in that story element anyways, because you've kind of, in a weird way, made Chris's dad seem redeemable. Like in some universe, somewhere out there, he's a better person. And I guess that's true, but I just don't know if that's the right message. Sure, you need your characters to be likable, and Gunn is really great at that, but they are still bad people. Problem with Peacemaker Season 2 is that it humanizes racists and incels in a way that doesn't feel right. Like, I love Vigilante, but he's a serial killer, and he's simply presented as quirky and misunderstood. And I get it, Gunn wants us to recognize the humanity in all people, in people like Peacemaker and Vigilante, and how they all have the potential for growth and change. But you can't ignore the fact that it's humanizing a group of people who feel entitled to hold Yahtzee-like views just because they can't get a date. Is painting those people in a more appealing light really good or bad for the current problem? Don't get me wrong, I loved this season just as much as my dimensional doppelganger did, and the story itself is great, is very enjoyable, but it's part of a toxic trend that we've seen in comic books lately. We've seen a massive rise in the popularity of gritty anti-heroes who aren't supposed to be the bastions of morality like Superman. And while it's allowed for some more complex storytelling, we've really started to lose the plot. The best example I can give you is what's recently happened with the Red Hood series. So basically what happened here is that DC canceled their Red Hood series after Gresham Felker Martin, the writer behind the title, was fired due to her post following Kirk's assassination. For example, this is some of what she said. Of course, I don't endorse anything that she's saying, nor do I endorse political violence in any way, shape, or form, and it's totally valid for people to be mad about what she said. But you know who wouldn't be mad about what she said? Red Hood, the character that she was writing about. The Red Hood is a character who not only believes in capital punishment, but is pretty liberal with delving it out whenever he feels it's necessary. He's taken people out for much less than the things that Kirk has said. I'm not saying that this justifies those actions by any means, and I don't think that statements like the one Gretchen said are okay. But if those posts really are as bad as everyone is acting like they are, then why are we heroicizing characters who would not only agree with those posts, but act out on them? And that lies the problem with heroicizing anti-heroes and putting objectively bad people in a more likable light. And that's the big difference between Gunn's success with characters like Superman versus what he's doing with Peacemaker. Because Superman is a hero, and these superhero stories do so much better when they have a moral character to ground these things off of. Otherwise, we're left searching for a protagonist with the cast of crew that's left, and when you have nothing to choose from but awful people, you end up apologizing for some of their worst traits and endorsing their worst qualities. It's the exact same problem that we see with cops slapping the Punisher logo all over their cars. The Punisher is a serial killer, not a good person. And where your job is to serve and protect, well, then you probably shouldn't idolize terrorists like the Punisher. While the intentions behind Peacemaker are much less nefarious, it still suffers from a similar problem. And as we said before, Gunn makes very likable characters, and in this case, I think they're just a little too likable. I mean, the show humanizes racists because they're nice to us. For fuck's sake, you had Adebayo apologizing for Chris being oblivious to a literal Nazi universe. That just feels weird. So yes, season 2 of Peacemaker is the perfect parallel for the radicalization of incels, but it paints them as misunderstood, and that's not helpful because they're also very, very dangerous. As much as James Gunn jokes about them being serial killers, they are the most likely to be mass shooters. That's not a hyperbole, that's just statistics. Let me show you. You're looking up statistics for mass shootings, and we go down here and look at by gender. Solo male dominates the mass shooting percentages by a long shot, 94.7%. Now, granted, this was updated, I believe, at the beginning of 2025, so it may be a little bit out of date. And the average age of mass shooters is around 34, big number of them being in the 20 to 29 range. And of course, biggest thing is that most of these mass shooters are in fact white. So when you put it in that context, Gunn's humanization of these kind of characters could potentially be really dangerous. They're not presented as the danger that they really are and the massive threat that they are. I think Gunn did a great job creating these complex characters, but the more complex we make these characters, we need to think of what their actual impact could be.
Especially because, as we see in the finale, they're still getting fucked too. Their radicalization has left them fighting a culture war, making them completely blind to the class war in front of them, just like Peacemaker was blindsided by Rick Flag and his crew. So at least Gunn got that part right.
Which is why I think Gunn may have gotten this one wrong here. But of course, that's just my take, and I want to hear yours. Do you see the parallels between Peacemaker Season 2 and the male loneliness epidemic, or do you think that this is just a massive stretch? Do you think that the way that Gunn has humanized this issue is problematic, or is it empathetic? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, might as well make sure you're subscribed. Really appreciate you guys watching all the way to the end, and if you want even more content, you can find me on all of my socials. You can find me on TalkTick, Twatch, Instagram, and X. Twitter, or whatever bird sound that guy recently named it to. All right, well, I've got to hide my doppelganger's body. I've got to get back to my reality. So I will catch you next time. Peace.